The other thing is that I've been seeing as the economy has its waves and companies are doing layoffs, like OSPOs are on the chopping block very often, or people who are working on open source. So even when you have a job within a company that includes working on open source as part of your job, it doesn't always feel like the most secure position. And then at the same time, we are facing the maintainer shortage in all open source projects out there. I don't have data. I should look into get some data about that. But it's definitely something that I personally hear left and right. And then you get the numbers of the 80-95% of all modern software depending on or containing open source or being open source software. So it's just, I think we are at the time when we need to figure this out, but it's really unclear what the best way of working or structure is for this. And I think there are probably also people who would be happy to maintain a project, but they don't necessarily want to work for a large company to do that. Like running the risk of being reassigned to other projects that they don't want to work on. So there are a lot of considerations on both the company side as well as the individual side when it comes to how to maintain the open source projects. And yes, talking about the bug fixing aspect rather than the new feature development aspect, which is still more, I think it's probably easier for companies to justify and figure out why to work on new features upstream versus the regular maintenance type of work, which is probably a little bit less tied to revenue.
I think on the maintenance type work, the best solutions I've seen are companies pulling together to hire people. So like putting money in the Linux Foundation to hire someone. Because why would one company, sometimes it's not even a full-time job, but why would one company bear that for all companies? I think is kind of the argument every company uses when it comes up. But on the OSPOs, I've been thinking about that quite a bit because I have a lot of friends that were affected and laid off because the OSPO was kind of shut down. And I think it goes back to the conversation we were having earlier on the whether it's new versus old OSPOs or OSPOs focused on compliance versus outreach or education. I think OSPOs evolve with their company, and I think sometimes the OSPO that you have is no longer the OSPO that you may need, or maybe you don't need an OSPO anymore. And there's still tons to do. My friends are like, well, there's lots of work to do. There's still lots of work to do to help a company use open source. But I think it has evolved, and maybe management hasn't seen that evolution or doesn't understand. I don't know each individual case, but I think it has something to do with that evolution of what an OSPO does, and people seeing it as one thing and not the new thing. When I went, I actually hired Ashley Wolf to create GitHub's OSPO, but I argued quite fiercely before I did that GitHub did not need an OSPO. And I was finally told that everybody thought they did except for me, so please go do this anyway. So we did, but we focused the GitHub OSPO on creating tools for all OSPOs. So not just being GitHub's OSPO, but since GitHub already knew how to do open source, like how can we use the data that GitHub has and the knowledge that GitHub has to create tools for OSPOs. So it's a very different OSPO than you would find at, say a retail store who decided to create an OSPO because they discovered that they had open source software in their software.
So it sounds like what you're saying that OSPO is not a concrete definition of what the group should look like within a particular company. It depends on a lot of factors, like where the company is with their open source journey and what the nature of what they are doing, operator versus vendor company. So it, like when a company considers to create an open source program office, then they need to look into what their challenges are and what they would like to improve when it comes to approaching open source, as opposed to saying that OSPO is something like a template or a cookie cutter thing, and we need to have our OSPO just exactly how other companies structured theirs.
I think there are lots of templates you could copy, but there's not one single template for an OSPO. And I think if you run an OSPO, I think it's really important to see how you're evolving and to make sure your management chain's involved, and if the need is going away, to be able to recognize that. I don't know. There's no easy answer these days with layoffs and reorgs. I mean, it's a tumultuous time, but I do think OSPOs change over time.
No, and I think our conversation today has really hit upon a variety of different aspects that an OSPO can and should be responsible for. I mean, the car industry and creating the supply chain because there's a need and there's an obvious activity. Again, as we look at the regulation that's coming and as we look at the security posture, that needs to get tighter in many critical infrastructure types of businesses. There's a strategy in how you engage in open source to make that as efficient and as effective as possible, right? And those are new things, so it's an evolution, like what we were doing in the early 2000s, Stormy, from an open source standpoint. That's we were leading the path, I think, in many ways. And certainly from having conversations that I had, I expect you had the same types of conversations where, yeah, HP was somewhat of an early leader in that activity with the open source review board, and then what followed on from behind that. But I don't think there's any shortage of needs for adapting and improving this software supply chain that we now all rely on, and being strategically engaged in it to maximize it for company benefit. And engaging, and I have a strong personal view that engaging is one of the only ways that you really do that. Um, so yeah, I totally agree. It's adapting, right?
And to engage with it securely, like the government, when they look at using open source, that's one of their main concerns. So that's a new, like you were talking about earlier with the vulnerabilities and stuff being one of the main concerns these days for people using open source software.